I would sometimes even like take days off work. Just I would like call in sick just so I can like put more time into animal well. Why I really do what I do is to sort of get an answer for this like lifelong fascination of like how all this stuff works. Having hot reloading working uh, was kind of just like the single biggest win I think you can get because then it like relieves the necessity to like make a lot of tools and editor GUI. Yeah, that's like how I typically like best understand things is I'm kind of willing to let myself make mistakes or I'm very skeptical of anybody telling me like this is the way to do it, this is required.
Hello everyone, my name is Łukasz and this is the Game Engineering Podcast. This time I'm joined by Billy Basso, a solo developer of Animal Well. He made this game from scratch, by himself. It took him 7 years. We talk about engine layer, game code architecture, state management, audio system, everything. And with that, let's meet Billy Basso. What is Animal Well in a couple of sentences?
So yeah, Animal Well is hard to describe for me in a couple sentences, but it's this game where you kind of hatch from a flower and you find yourself in this like underground world, and it's a 2D pixel art game, but with like a more kind of sophisticated lighting system, I would say, and you kind of just explore this like kind of watery subterranean environment, and the game doesn't give you any direction or tell you what you should be doing. And um, along the way, you find a lot of like sort of hidden passageways, and there's a lot of different animals and creatures around, but you don't really know if they're like friendly or dangerous. So you kind of always have to be reassessing your environment and paying close attention to things. And the game is just filled with puzzles and kind of hazards. And I don't know, it's kind of just best experience with as little information going into it as possible, I would say.
Was this one of the core design principles not to say and spoil things ahead, just to drop you in and let you explore?
Yeah, I would say that was a core design principle. Like I, I was getting kind of frustrated with a lot of modern games that just like had a really slow start, and they would load you down with just like tutorials and like exposition uh and if there was a moment in the gameplay where you were like maybe gonna have a satisfying discovery, like it would give you a hint like before you even get a chance to think about it. Like the famous example I always think of is in like the newer God of War games when you go into a room and there's like some simple puzzle where you like throw your axe at like a water wheel or something to like open a passage, and within like 10 seconds your son is like, hey, maybe we should like throw her, like look at that thing over there. And then it's like you don't even get a chance to like even take in all the information on screen and have a thought before the game is like so anxious that you might get bored and um kind of, I don't know, go on TikTok or something. Uh so I was just like seeing more that be applied more and more in games, and kind of wanted to push back against that. Um, and yeah, it was also kind of a challenge for myself because I do think uh, later in development it is easier to put something in a game and just explain it literally with like text or like an on-screen UI. Um, but it's harder to sort of implicitly convey all that information through like the level design or the the sort of actions that the player has available to them. So I always viewed like having an explicit menu as sort of like um, a patch, or like it's like almost like it might as well just be gray box like game design. Like you, it just is. There's nothing interesting or interactive about it. It's just like the game literally telling you something you could do, and yeah, it feels like a workaround. So I was trying to do that as little as possible.
Okay. Why do you say that later in development it's more difficult?
I think probably just because you have been working on the game longer and you're probably more anxious to finish it, or at least this is how I felt. And um, there may be things like that you see people in playtest struggling with, and they just don't understand part of the game. So you need to like make some sort of design change um, to like help them understand. And this is like what I've heard happened in like the case of God of War, where they like had they designed the game and they had these puzzles in the environments, and then they probably did some playtesting or focus groups maybe after a lot of the um, more detailed environment art came in, and it was like simple in gray box, but then maybe it became a little more confusing afterwards. And and at that point you have so much stuff in the game, and it's like become more rigid that it's harder to change. So the easy thing to do is to just like throw in like a line of dialogue that kind of just tells you what to do versus like go back and have to redo all that content, or make more dramatic like art changes that
Okay.
would maybe make it clearer.
Okay. Okay. How long have you been working on Animal Well, and how did this like type of work changed?
Yeah, so it started in 2017, probably like over the summer. Um, and it started as just like a really small, like kind of 2D Metroidvania slash game engine project that I was just started programming for fun. I just wanted to. It was around the time I started watching Handmade Hero, which I saw we were going to get into. And prior to that, I had made like a really kind of bloated general purpose 3D engine. Um, that was a good like learning experience, and I would just kind of work in for fun and try to implement various things that would be in a game, like just like a 3D like FBX mesh importer, or just parsing different files, or learning how to like serialize and deserialize like a scene, and kind of developing like an understanding of like how all these parts fit together, and just making it a little basic editor with gizmos that I can move things around in. But that ultimately like didn't result in me making a game. I kind of was just making like a really shitty version of Unity that that was like way more annoying to use, but and only for me. And performance was like kind of bad because I was doing things in a very like object oriented way with shared pointers, and was not thinking about like memory locality at all, or like the lifetime of things. So uh, and I just didn't really. It was an OpenGL as well, and I was one of my ability as like a graphics programmer was much more basic. So I remember just having like there was tons of overdraw, and I was having like this one expensive shader for the lighting like run on like every single triangle, but and then if I made it like full screen, the game would like run at like a pretty shitty frame rate. So so yeah, eventually I just had to like it was fun for a few years, and then I kind of after started watching Handmade Hero, I was kind of inspired to just reboot the whole thing, and I was like, I was never going to make a 3D game to begin with. I don't even I barely know how to 3D model at all, so why am I writing importers to for that kind of stuff? At best, I can do 2D art. I had some illustration ability, um, and I knew that like games just take a long time, so I was like, I'm going to make a 2D game that will be like an hour long, and I'll like finish it in 6 months, and I'm gonna just like intentionally limit the scope. It's like I know how to do a lot of things related to 3D game development, but I'm gonna like cut myself off from that just for the sake of like really limiting it to things that I'm more confident I could do, and commit to finishing. So yeah, the idea was really just to finish something, and it wasn't trying to be this ambitious like project. It was more like a learning experience, and then just like a personal goal for myself to like put something out into the world, because I'd been working as a game programmer at other studios for a while at that point, and really wanted to make like an indie game, and I didn't really care that it was like a giant hit or anything or big in scope. I just wanted to like say I finished something and like point to a game that was mine, and I couldn't like do that at that point despite like putting so many years of work into various projects. So that's kind of how Animal Well started, and then it just really like slowly, gestated over the next like 7 years, and became this project that I would just work on in the mornings and after work, and then it was became kind of very addictive to to add to.
You were
And
working full job as a game programmer, and then you were doing overtime as Animal World developer.
yes,
How many hours daily?
um, so yeah, I'd be working like 8 hours a day at my day job, and then um, I would say each day I tried to squeeze in 1 to 2 hours in the morning, and then maybe I would work for, I don't know, depending on the day, a few hours after work. Sometimes it'd be like late into the night, but sometimes I like wouldn't at all. And then usually I was eager to spend my weekends working on it as well. So it was kind of like an obsessive kind of thing, where I just really wanted to fill all my free time with it. And then I would sometimes even like take days off work. I would like call in sick just so I can like put more time into Animal Well. Um, or like Christmas break, I'd be like really excited about that. And yeah, it was just like all I really wanted to do. Luckily, I had a job at the time that like I didn't wasn't that creatively demanding, so I still had a lot of game design ideas sort of fresh in my head,
Did you
and
have
kept me off guard.
like a burnout moment because of that, or
Yes, yeah, a few times actually, and so I would say the first few years there, if you can like look at my GitHub history, and it's like very spotty, I guess. There you could see like, oh, for these 3 months, it's like every day I was like just uh just working as hard as I could. And then there'd be like 4 months of nothing. I just like stopped, and I was like, I remember one time I'm just like, I just want to play Spelunky instead. And so I just like every day I just like got up and played that. Or maybe the things I was working on at my day job were more interesting to me, so I was more invested in that. But yeah, there was like big chunks where I just had to put the game on pause. But then, eventually over time, it would start like worming its way back into my head, and I had to start it again. And so, yeah, I think early on it was on and off, but then as the years went by, there was like fewer and fewer gaps, I guess, in my um, sort of contributions towards the project. And I would say the last 3 years were like totally like full time, pretty much. Where
you left your daily job at this point, right?
Yeah, I left it at in right at the January 1st of 2022. So, um, and then yeah, and then there was like COVID. So I was like working a lot then because I didn't have a commute, and I don't know, it was just like a more anxious time, and it was kind of like my escaped project that I just went like leaned into harder during that time. But yeah, I mean, it was a lot of a lot of work, but and it was kind of like yeah, very all consuming, I would say. Like it was the first thing I thought of when I would wake up in the morning, like what I wanted to do, and then it'd be what I was thinking about right before falling asleep, like what I did during that day and what am I like, eager to do next. It was kind of like something I didn't really feel in control of, to be honest.
And from start to finish, it took something like 7 years, right?
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And most of it, so half of it, or like 4 years, was uh, between your daily job and your spare time, and then it was more full time. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. Let's get back to the Handmade Hero for a second.
Okay.
I heard you saying in the interview that at some point you've seen this series of Casey Muratori uh, making games from scratch, and you showed this to other friends, and they were like, "Ooh, hoo, is he gonna do like operating system from scratch or like
Hmm.
kind of?" But you reacted to it differently, right? You reacted to it like, "That's cool." And
Hmm.
I think there's this like weird discrepancy with how people react to this series. And like, can you tell me a little bit more about like why did you find this cool?
I think probably because in college I had taken a few game engine programming classes, so I already had a little experience, like um, writing, just writing game engines. And we remember the first, I know this one that I was working on, like on the side, the 3D one, kind of was inspired by what I had learned in school. So we were using OpenGL, and we're doing a lot of the sort of basic things that would probably be the foundation for like a 3D, modern like game a big studio would make. Um, and so I think I just found that really cool. And I've always been like interested in knowing how computers work and how, where things live in memory. And uh, I always get frustrated when people like try to hand wave away like an explanation, because like that to me is like, I think why I really do what I do is to sort of get an answer for this like lifelong fascination of like how all this stuff works. Games have always been like one of the most complicated things that have like been in my life, and they're always just been kind of magical. So um, it's the same with like computers or TVs, just like all the technology I think I grew up with. It just seemed very very interesting to me, and I wanted to know how it worked. And so I think it was just like that mindset. When I saw the very first episode of Handmade Hero, I was already making a game engine, so I think that's probably why I was interested in it, because like, oh, here's like a really great resource that's coming online from someone who seems really experienced, and yeah, I want to watch this. I want to get better at this thing I'm trying to do. And I think a lot of my coworkers and friends that I remember mentioning it to, they didn't have that experience. I remember being at Foster Games, and we were using Unreal Engine 3 at the time. And I could already see the sort of the comparison between the two. Working in Unreal Engine was like, sure, it was like very powerful and could do a lot of things, and it was a giant code base, but it like took forever to recompile, and um, just like debugging things in it was really clunky and slow, and it was just like super heavyweight engine. And yeah, I just wanted, and I knew that like a small scale like C++ project could be pretty fast if it's like engineered right. So so I still like probably had more fun programming like a smaller scale project than working in like a big engine. So I just always wanted to develop games that way. Even early on, I didn't like have like sort of all the knowledge or skill to sort of complete it, but I just knew it was the more joyful way to work. And I was kind of like stubbornly sticking to that. And I think that's probably what kept me from finishing a game for a long time. I probably could have like released something in Unity or Unreal like within a few years out of college, and it would have been whatever. But I kind of held off on doing that to sort of take the long way there.
Okay. And you started watching Handmade Hero while you were developing the engine, the object-oriented 3D engine. And at some
Yeah.
point you said, wait, this doesn't match what I'm doing.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It was just slowly, like bit by bit, where I'm like, I remember, just complaining about, yeah, object oriented development and like using shared pointers and RAII, and it's just like bit by bit I was like, shit, I'm doing that, fuck. Like, damn it, okay. And I'm like, he's right, it is really dumb and it hasn't been helping me, and it is just making the project like a spaghetti mess of things that are actually hard, making it harder to debug, and it's adding a lot of complexity overhead. So yeah, it was kind of eye opening, and I attribute a lot of my like sort of engineering opinions now to like those original like Handmade Hero episodes. And I probably watched the first 100 episodes. I think I kind of binge watched them, and I remember my roommate at the time just being like kind of rolling their eyes like, oh, you're watching this guy again. Like I would watch it in like the living room, like on the TV. And I was like, God, that looks so boring. You're just watching this person program like in real time. It's not even edited. but but I just like, yeah, watched it all, and yeah, just like I feel like I learned a ton, and it made it immediately made me become a better programmer at work. I felt like I was just faster and could kind of cut through the bullshit, I guess, when designing things. And uh, yeah, I just like gained a lot of confidence, I think, from that.
Yeah, I rewatched a couple of episodes, the early ones, recently, and it was so cool. Like you can see, for example, cases like, oh, and I don't remember whether stack grows, like decreases, or
Mhm.
increases the number of the memory. Let's find out. And he's like live checking it, and he's like,
Yeah,
I didn't even know that you can actually like, get an information from the pointer. Like that's so cool.
yeah,
And he's like, oh, let's check that. Let's check that. Like sipping some almond milk or whatever. It really,
right. Yeah, he's always taking his big swigs of almond milk with his wrist braces on, and it
yeah.
was very endearing.
Yeah.
Uh,
So,
yeah, I think.
yeah,
Oh, go on.
you said 100 of episodes. Binge watch that. Did you manage to like formulate in your head what you're supposed to do, supposed to in quotes, for like your new engine and game, basically?
Yeah, one thing I remember being really impressed by was when there's one episode he sets up a DLL for all the gameplay code, and he kind of makes this separation, this boundary between like the platform and the game. Um, and I think before I had this very fuzzy, and I was already having like a game library and an engine, but I think for me the engine was very fuzzy, and it just had all this functionality that was not distinguished between being like portable and like platform dependent. And I realized like that's actually the only uh, sort of distinction that matters. That's like because I wasn't trying to make like a reusable game engine that I would like distribute or open source. So it didn't matter to me that um, there was like extracted game systems that lived in like a shared place. But it did matter that stuff that was Windows specific lived in a specific place, because then if I ported to consoles or other platforms, that's the stuff that would need to get rewritten. So there's a very like real pragmatic reason for that code to be separated. Before, I think making libraries felt more like a more arbitrary um like subjective thing, where it's like this is just where I like it to be, and it's like it's like putting things in folders or something. But I really started thinking along the lines of like, what is if I architect something this way, like what are the benefits? What are like the real tangible benefits? Not just like, oh, it fits this mental model that like is pleasing to me or something. It like actually allows certain functionality or runs faster. So yeah, that kind of like focused my thinking. But then yeah, the thing that I really got excited to put in my engine was the game code like hot reloading. So if all the game is in a DLL and the engine is the executable, and you allocate all your memory up front and like pass it into the DLL, then um, you can make changes to it, recompile the DLL, have the game check that there's a newer version on disk, and like close the other one, reload it, and like relink to it. Like, and you just have a couple functions like setup, update, and draw or whatever. And um, and then like the game just reloads itself and everything is just exactly in place. And doing that in C++ like was like really cool to me because uh, it's also, I'm coming from the point of view of using Unreal Script at work at the time, which was just like kind of a neat language, but it was really slow and you didn't have like editor, like IDE support for it. And it was always like really confusing that you had these like two languages you were writing in, and there was like this, uh, the boundary between them was like really complicated. And it was just not, it didn't seem like it really added any benefit. I mean, it sure was like compiled a little bit faster than the C++, but it was like, it added so much complexity. And I just like was kind of annoyed with it. So I was like, oh, if you could just use C++ as your main, game scripting language. And the only issue with it is it probably compiles slow, or you have to relaunch the whole game to like see your changes. But if you can fix that, then it like it was really kind of game changing. So um, then having hot reloading working uh, was kind of just like the single biggest win I think you can get, because then it like relieves the necessity to like make a lot of tools and editor GUIs to like inspect variables, because you can kind of just very intuitively like change the code. You can even just like type numbers directly into the code. You can move things around, and just like if you can quickly recompile, you kind of have access to like everything within the state of the game. And um, yeah, it's just like such a powerful thing to have, and for how relatively easy it is to set up if you do things right.
If you follow the Casey Muratori series.
Yeah, and it's luckily within just like the first few episodes. I think he gets to that point, so you don't have to watch that far.
I think there's a lot of people that say the same. Like, don't Handmade Hero is not about watching the entire series. It's about watching until you feel comfortable enough you can follow along on your own
Mhm.
and do your thing.
Yeah, I think that's true because yeah, after a while, I did kind of I kind of fell behind because he was making them like daily for a while, and I couldn't watch them like at the speed he was recording them.
And
uh,
he was inventing them. Like that's the double the work.
yeah, it was pretty prolific for a while. And then I think after a while, I kind of felt like I was good on my own. It's like, okay, I learned enough where I feel very confident in where this is going, and the project feels very solid, and I can kind of take it from here. But um, it was important in the beginning.
Can you speak a little bit more to the, for example, strategies or like C++ conventions, code conventions, architectures that you applied to Animal Well that proved to be worthy from Handmade
Mm.
Hero or other sources?
Yeah, I think yeah, I think programming in a very like bare bones C style way with minimal sort of C++ features has been really nice, and I kind of started doing that more then, and I continue to do it to this day. So I declared just a lot of like plain old data type structs that with no member um, methods, or and then I just usually initialize them to 0. Sometimes I will let do inline initialization for some variables, but most of the time I'm not expecting any constructors or destructors to be called. And if I need to initialize something, I'll write like an explicit function to do that. But I think the biggest thing that has helped me keep the code organized is really having a solid understanding of sort of the lifetime of where data lives. And so that means, so an animal, for example, you launch the game, and then there's some global state that gets allocated, based on uh, initializing DirectX and Xinput and all these systems and loading the fonts. And there are just some things that just need to exist for the whole duration of the game, or allocating a big vertex buffer. Um, and so having all that stuff like live together in one block of memory like makes sense. And then you're going to load one of your save files, and you're going to kind of load the game. And all of that is going to exist in memory until you quit back to the main menu and you like quit the game. So there's another struct that's just like the game state, and that's all the stuff that should exist during this time frame, like while playing the game. And then within the game, you navigate the world, and you go between different screens, and the camera never moves. So there's a lot of things that are only relevant while you're on that screen. So then there's like the screen state, and that's within the game state. And then every time you switch screens, the screen state just gets like wiped out and reinitialized. Um, so I never really had any memory leaks. And the game, I remember like, people being surprised, like, oh, the game never crashes. Like, why, why is that? So many indie games crash. And it's like, well, there's not really many ways it can crash. It's just because I allocate everything up front. And things kind of live in these very predetermined places. And so there aren't a lot of pointers. Everything's just in like fixed size arrays, or have like finite sort of um, like boundaries that they exist within. Uh, and and yeah, if there is like a bug within something that was on screen, like when you walk off the screen, it'll like get cleared away. So it also like things, it kind of keeps things contained within like a scope of how bad they can be.
Okay.
Uh, so
Okay.
yeah, that's like a good something I've been happy with, and like what I'm trying to continue doing.
Regarding the allocation of the memory upfront,
Mhm.
tell me, I'm a beginner in this. I feel like this works for the smaller type of games where you can sort of predict what will happen.
Mhm.
If you
Mhm.
have like a giant game, 3D, with a lot of things that you can't predict,
Mhm.
would it be still possible to allocate like 10 gigabytes of RAM and then just chunk it? Or it doesn't really make sense and you kind of have to get back to like dynamically allocating things as you go? Because when you say that you allocate upfront, I have this vision of like you have an array, for example, for
Mhm.
enemies, you allocate like 60 of them. You said that
Mhm.
they're disabled, and then whenever you need to make one actually working, you have like set the flag to enabled, and now he's running around the screen, for example.
Yeah. So it can get a little tricky, even for Animal Well. When I first started programming, I did what you just described, and it did work. So every time I created a new entity type, um, and in Animal Well, an entity may be like a bunny or something, but it also may just be one tile of grass that like wiggles around. So there's like a ton of grass entities that need to be updated, or a bush is another entity type, and pretty much anything that has interactions or moves around. Um, and every time I made just wanted to add a new one to the game, I created another fixed size array. So it's like, and then I had to just kind of pull a number out of my head of like, what's the maximum amount there might be? And for some things, I'm like, I don't know, maybe there's gonna be like 64 of them, or maybe there's gonna be 1,000. I don't know. So and then I'd have all these parallel arrays that were padded out with a ton of extra space, and that quickly seemed like it was very obvious that that was kind of wasteful. And I'm and and then if you allocate one more than the limit, then you like hard lock or crash or whatever, or you don't allocate it, so something goes missing. So it's like I wanted to come up with a system that like sort of unified the pool of memory for all the entities. So what I do to work around that is when I initialize a screen, it's I think in Animal it's about 40 by 22 tiles, I think, if I remember. So and the way I spawn anything in the game is it's all tile based. So you walk on screen and you loop over this 40 by 22 2D array of tiles, and each tile is like 16 um, I think it's like 4 bytes, I think, or something. So it stores like a tile ID, and then it has some flags about whether it's like flipped or rotated, or and then it has some extra bits that you can like store arbitrary data in. Um, and so I check each tile, and then each tile may just be art that's like static on screen, or it may correspond to an entity type to spawn. And so I loop over every tile, and I pretty much count up how many of each entity there are on this one given screen you're about to walk onto. And then I do the math to multiply the size of each of those entity types, and I pretty much add up all the required space. And then um, that's how much space I need for the entities. And then I have some code that will then kind of give them each a fixed size array that's exactly the size of what they want, and then they're all like contiguous in memory. So it pretty much requires like a pre-pass to like tally up all the entities, and then I kind of like give them their memory from like one big block I already have. And then there is a max limit on like how much memory a screen can use, but um, it's all at least like contiguous and not fragmented in any way. And it really wasn't even that much. Like, I mean, for Animal Well, I hardly ever use more than like a couple kilobytes for a screen, so I could have like made it 10 times bigger without like it even mattering. But yeah, and then and it's also super limited, so you're only seeing one screen at a time. This would scale up for a game where, say, a Metroidvania where things are still updating off screen, and you'd have like a more larger general area, and it would probably still facilitate that. But yeah, I maybe if you were scaling up to like a true open world game, then you could probably still chunk up the world in this way. Just
Yeah.
the boundaries would be sort of fuzzier, and you'd probably have to maybe use another thread to like preload them in like kind of a dormant state ahead of time or something, and then kind of swap them in and out as needed. But yeah, it's just like you have this super large data set, but then you're kind of like sparsely loading it into like the zone of play as you like move around.
Okay.
If that
Okay.
makes sense.
Okay. So from the super high level overview, you have a state, like a global state for everything that is needed during pretty much the lifetime of the process. And then you have a game state that is more related to the gameplay in general.
Mhm.
And then you have like a scene state for the screen you're in, right?
Mhm.
And I'm assuming you have some sort of abstraction also for like the renderer part, not to
Mhm.
for the gameplay code not to interact too much with the rendering, to have some sort of clear abstraction.
Yeah.
Is there any high level block from looking at this, let's say from this point of view, that you'd like to mention in terms of like architecture of the project?
Um, yeah, I think that's like a good summary of the memory layout. I will say that having a good abstraction over the renderer was like kind of an important change I made at one point. Um, so just wrapping a lot of the basic calls I was using in DirectX, like draw verts, or set a constant buffer, or um, just the things I was using to get my art on screen, or like set a shader, and set a shader resource. Once I had like a good wrapper around that, I could then very easily kind of iterate on the way I was rendering the game. So um, I could create new shaders, and I also got like hot reloading working for shaders, which was important. But so once I had a workflow where I can like edit my shaders, I can sort of mess with the render pipeline itself, the order of the draw calls and like what state gets set, and that would hot reload without any issues. Having those two things, I think, allowed me to be like very creative in how I sort of came up with like the art style of the game and like how lighting got calculated and what buffers were used for what. But yeah, before that, I was kind of hard coding everything in like direct in the render, the DirectX renderer itself. I was just kind of like allocating sort of the textures and buffers that I needed, and I eventually slowly like moved all that stuff out and made the game responsible for like using an API to like ask for all that stuff and sort of be responsible for it. And the pretty much the more stuff I moved into the game side of things, the better. And tried to make the engine as thin and small as possible. And every time I did that, it was like a win because then if I have to port to something, there's just like less code to write. And it probably works better with the hot reloading than if it lives in the game. And there's less like for Animal Wall, I have a new project now that I'm very early on in. But in Animal Wall, the editor kind of exists separately from the game. It's still running within the same executable, but it's programmed specifically for Windows and is opening up Windows and is using or like dialog boxes and stuff. Um, and that doesn't like support hot reloading. So the editor as a result like ended up being much more primitive than a lot of things in the game because my iteration time on it was so much worse. uh, and it's kind of it was tedious to add any new functionality to the editor, so it kind of just stayed the way it was, or just like developed much more slowly. But with the new project I've set up now, the editor is treated much more just like the game, where its memory is able to be reloaded, and it's kind of platform independent. And I've already made like a much better editor just like having it set up that way because I can just like sort of live code the GUI for it and stuff.
So
And
you
there's
did end up making an editor. I was under the assumption that you managed to do entire animal well without with just the hold reload without the editor.
yeah, so it is very much like a code driven project, and a lot of the things in the game are kind of just configured directly in the code. But I just the having the editor is there to design the levels and to like sort of paint the tiles on the grid, and sort of I have a world view where I can kind of move the screens around at a larger scale. So it's pretty basic. It doesn't do a lot of stuff, but it does let me sort of um, just lay out the screens and copy paste things and um, yeah, literally design the levels. That's about all it does. And then the rest of it is I draw all my art in Sprite, and then I had like a custom animation format for that would like pack the sprites into a sprite sheet and then create like a little binary file alongside it that had the like frame data and the UV coordinates. Um, and then those would get packed onto a bigger like sprite atlas. So most of the art in the game shared the same like big sprite atlas. So um, and then the editor would like sort of read that in.
Okay.
So that was the big like authoring tool I used was Sprite for art, and then my level editor, and then the rest was just like the C++ code that kind of glued everything together.
Okay. You had any config files as well for all sorts of properties, or was it just in code?
No, um, and I kind of regret having not having at least something. I think in the future I'm going to have at least one like config file that is like human readable for like just game settings or like graphic settings and stuff. But no, it's like that was all just stored in the binary like sort of save file. Because the game was just built to be, for some reason I just really wanted it to be one executable with no extra files in the directory. And I wanted to be able to just like drag the game around like onto your desktop and stuff and like click on it, and it always worked. Uh, and so there's no external like editable config files. Everything was either declared as just like a variable in C in a header file, or even for localization, those are all just like C strings. I did at least like, I had like a macro trick where I can like put all the strings in a file, and then it would include a different, like all the header files based on, there's one for each language, and they'd all get included. And but still in the game, they're effectively just big like constant C string.
So for the localization, you like were extracting the strings in English, putting them into
Mhm.
some sort of spreadsheet for somebody else to add the translation and then getting back to the code.
Yes, exactly. It was kind of a tedious process, and I think because that process was tedious, that's probably why the localization didn't go through enough like iterations, and there was like a lot of bugs snuck in. So I do wish I made some kind of like more sophisticated system where I can at least like it would have been great if all the strings existed outside of the game, and I could send a build to a localizer and have them actually test the game like while they were sort of updating the strings, and like, see in real time kind of like what the context was and what it looked like. So I think having better tooling in for that would have actually made the game better. So maybe next time I'll try to take that a step further.
Okay. What kind of graphics APIs you implemented?
Mm. Yeah. So early on, it was just DirectX 11, and this was when I started the project. It was actually like very early on, kind of just started as a DirectX 11 tutorial that I was following of just getting like a triangle on screen. I had used OpenGL before, and this was like an opportunity where I like wanted to learn DirectX as well. And I heard DirectX 11 was like easier to use, and I think DirectX 12 had maybe just come out not too long before that, but I was a little intimidated by it. So for a while, it was just DirectX 11, and then in about 2020, I reached out to Nintendo, and after a while of like bugging them, managed to get like a Switch dev kit. And I was really excited because it was the first console like dev kit I ever got. Um, and then upon reading the documentation, I realized like, oh, they don't support. Obviously, they don't support DirectX. It's a Microsoft thing, but you can either use Vulkan or you can use their like custom Nintendo uh, API that they made. Um, and maybe at that point I should have just switched to Vulkan, but instead I was like, no, I want to know more about their API. So I implemented the Nintendo graphics API alongside DirectX 11. And that was pretty different. I think in retrospect, it's very similar to DirectX 12. You have to like kind of you do a lot of the allocation yourself. But it was fun to finally learn a new graphics API, and then that was really when I had to like get good about making an abstraction in the game layer that would then be able to like call either one of these APIs, and they both had to sort of match. And so for a while, it was those two, and then um, PlayStation. I did the PlayStation port after that, maybe a year or two later. And at that point, I also realized like they support either Vulkan or their custom API, and maybe I should have switched to Vulkan yet again, and I could have had everything just use the same one. But I then just implemented the PlayStation specific API as well, um, and yeah, it's just so I had three graphics APIs at that point, and then later still had to do the Xbox port. And for Xbox, you just have to use DirectX 12. Um, and and at that point, I had to then upgrade DirectX 11 to DirectX 12, and that was like pretty different. And but it was, at least I had experience with like the Nintendo and PlayStation APIs, which were again pretty similar to DirectX 12. But DirectX 11 is like the one old one of the bunch. Uh, So I had to implement four graphics APIs for for 4 different platforms. uh, and then I switched the PC, version to DirectX 12 as well, which maybe I could have kept 11 working, but it was just like too much to maintain that I didn't want to. It would break, and then I'd have to go in and fix it, and I would really slow down iteration, I guess, to have yet another one to worry about.
Did you like the porting experience?
I did actually, because I it was very fun for me to kind of just read through the documentation for the SDKs, and it was cool to finally kind of peek behind the curtain and see how all these consoles work and like what features are actually available. And um, like, yeah, I just it was always something I wondered about, and it was cool. And like there are things that a lot of games just don't take advantage of, like the like being able to read the color of the Joy-Con controller. There's like an API for that, or the Nintendo Switch, actually, the NFC reader that's used for amiibos can it has functionality to read like a Japanese subway card that like no games use at all, but it's like in the documentation, and they give it to you as an example. And I wanted to design a puzzle around that, but never. Kind of had to get cut. Um, but yeah, so it was fun, and then it's just like a fun engineering challenge, I guess. To like have to adjust your architecture to like cleanly accept all these like variants. Um,
Great.
so yeah.
How did you organize your development in general? Like you made the game yourself and it had so many dimensions to it, right? You needed to manage both like coding aspects, sound aspects, localization, art. Like how did you organize your time during the development and like managed to hit on all of the things, like finish them,
Mhm.
but also like not to forget about some dimension like sound, for example, things like that.
Yeah. Um, I did not like explicitly like create like a roadmap for myself. I kind of just worked on whatever was the most pressing thing at any given moment. Like it was kind of obvious if you would just play the game, and like if it looks good but there's like the sound effects are terrible or there's no sound at all, it's like obviously I need to get a better way to make sounds. And then maybe I would so a lot of the things went through a lot of versions, uh, where I would kind of make a bad system first and then use it for like a while, and then like realize afterwards I have to redo it. Um, so for sound, for example, I was using X Audio 2, the Windows API for it, and that works fine. But when I was sort of initially just getting the code set up, so in X Audio you have these things that are called source voices that pretty much it's like an object that you can feed a buffer of audio to, just raw or a raw audio stream, and it will. And if that source voice is hooked up to a mastering voice, it will like play the sound. That's kind of like the basic architecture of X Audio. And in between there, you can have what are called submix voices to let you like mix. So you could group all the sound effects together and all the music together, and then like give them a separate volume or apply effects to one group of them. Um, so early on, I was pretty much creating a new source voice for every single sound effect in the game that could play. So the way I had architected was like, okay, I have an audio file that corresponds to like the jump sound or something, or the chest opening sound. Um, and I would load that sound file, and then while like calling an API to like create the sound, I would create a voice for it. And then I quickly realized like, oh, if I have 1,000 sounds, there are now 1,000 source voice objects all like on this graph, and that's probably not how I'm supposed to use it, because there's probably a limit to them, and they might, I don't know, I don't know how expensive that is. So I had to like re-architect that to like have a finite set of source voices, and then the audio buffers exist in memory, and any one of them could be submitted to any source voice. And I needed a little layer in between that sort of kept track of which ones were free and that they could like play a sound through. And then that was like that was a better design. And then another dumb thing I did was uh, I was using org vorbis files as the format because it's open source, and there's actually a really good C++ library, stb vorbis, maybe people might have heard of, that lets you play them, and I am using that to sort of decode the file into the raw audio data. So I was authoring all my sounds in org vorbis, and that was like they were like the source assets. But then if I wanted to change the bit rate of them, I couldn't easily do that because I had just they were kind of like the source of truth, but they were like if you look it up, like org vorbis is a lossy format. And so I had to later on switch to like actually saving everything as like uncompressed wave files, and then have a build step that converts them to Vorbis files, and I had to sort of extend like my MS build like project file to like have a like for each wave file like output a Vorbis file, and then I could globally change the quality of them just by editing like sort of the build step that does that, because there's a command line tool that will do the conversion like given up, and one of the options is you can like change the quality. So then that was like a better and an improvement on that. And each of these times it was like I dealt with like the bad system for months or years, and then I realized I have to go back and improve it. And then if there's like a different file format that is better for a certain platform that maybe they have like native hardware decoding for within the build process, I can just output a different file type entirely. I don't have to use Vorbis for like every platform. I can they can be converted to whatever is needed. But then that's just one example of like the audio system kind of had to go through like 3 versions over the course of development. But now if I were making a new game, I would just do the last version first. Like I would skip all that. I kind of know, I understand the whole problem space much better now.
Yeah, yeah, but you needed to go through them to actually get there, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's like how I typically like best understand things is I'm kind of willing to let myself make mistakes, or I'm very skeptical of anybody telling me like this is the way to do it, this is required, because there's so many bits of advice where that'll just lead you into making a really bloated uh, general purpose game engine like I was doing before, because everybody's saying you need all these things. Like if you read the what is it, game engine architecture book, within the first page there's like a first few pages there's like a giant diagram, and it's based on the Naughty Dog engine, which like I'm sure it's very complicated and they needed it to be to make those AAA games. But sorry, there's a cuckoo clock's going to go off and just interrupt me. Um, but like if you're a beginner looking at that, you think you need all this stuff just to like ship any kind of game, but you don't. You need all that stuff to ship like a AAA game made by a team of like 500 people. So I was really just wanting to know like what is absolutely necessary for just me to make a small scale game with pixel art that doesn't do any like level streaming, and doesn't I'm not working on a large team where I have version control like conflict issues. So I really wasn't making anything or solving any problem until it actually confronted me as a real issue. So I, in a way, was like happy to make the dumb version first and just like see how far it took me. And then when it actually became an issue, then I had to try harder and make something more complicated.
yeah.
But I didn't do it until it hurt not to.
It's nice that like this is the same mentality that took you from this like 3D general engine to actually making a game and treating this engine as a thin layer. the same
Mhm.
mentality applied on a micro level for the each system that you've been working with,
Yes.
and
Yeah. It was
those.
just like kind of my simple like algorithm that I just followed where I'm just like, I'm gonna do the dumbest, most obvious thing. Even at first I was putting all my game code into like one file just called like game.cpp, and I was like, why should it be in another file? It doesn't matter. That's like cognitive overhead of like every time I want to add new code, I have to then think like, oh, what file should it go in? But instead I'm like, there's no question it should go in the game file. Uh,
Yeah.
and things then I would break things up a little bit afterwards where I'm like, okay, here's all this code that's related to collision detection. Maybe I shouldn't be recompiling that every single time I change something totally unrelated. So I'll put that in its own file kind of well after the fact when it's very obvious that it's its own thing. But for a while, I just most new things I just like let live there. And eventually I did come up with an entity system that did sort of by design have you create one new file per entity, and that kind of helped with compile times a lot because then it
Can
only
we
is needed.
can we talk a little bit about this? You mentioned like a cool macro trick about like
Mm-hmm.
doing the entities, so adding new entities instead of just like doing the manual work to speed this up. Can you walk me through this?
Sure. So in Animal Well, there are entities, and each entity is really just an arbitrary struct. They have nothing in common with each other. Like you would maybe assume there's a base class for them that at least has like position data or some flags, but like I don't even have that. They have nothing in common. An entity is just like if there's a for if there's an entity for a rabbit, it's just struct rabbit, like open brace, close brace, and then whatever you think should be in there is in there, and nothing else. So when I first started working on the game, I was doing that, and then anytime I wanted to add a new one, there's a certain set of things that all needs to happen to all of them. They need to be updated, they need to be drawn, and then they need to be created. So and maybe there's a few other things, but early on that's all they needed. So I'd have a section in the code that was just in like the game CPP like update function that like looped over all the pieces of grass, looped over all the mice, looped over all the rabbits, and then like just called update on all of them. And it's just like the dumbest code you can imagine. And then when they needed to be drawn, it went through all of them and just there was a loop for each one, and they all got updated together or drawn together. Um, and so, and in my mind, I'm like, yeah, this is tedious, but at least there's like, it's simple and there's good like data locality, I guess, because they're all the like things are being updated together, and it's compact and nothing has more data than it needs. But it was kind of obvious that uh, adding a new entity type was a little tedious. I had to go jump to like multiple points in the code to update when I would have really liked to just create a new file, and somehow it just like worked. So what I did is there's a macro trick that I remember learning from, I forget, one of the GDC talks I watched. That was I think just like various programming tricks. But what you can do is um, you can define a macro to mean something, like say uh, update an entity of a certain type, and you do um, you make a macro called like define entity, and then within parentheses it would just be like rabbit, and then what that macro corresponds to is a line of code that calls the update function for the rabbit, and it calls like the hard coded function name like update rabbit, and it uses the string tokenization to paste in rabbit into the name of the function that should be called. um, and then you can then undefine that, and then later in code you can have that same macro mean a different thing. It can mean you still do define entity rabbit, but in this spot in the code it means draw the rabbit. um, and so the final piece is you create a separate file, like just a C header file, and you declare one macro. Uh, you write out this. You use this macro to define every entity type. So you do like define entity rabbit, define entity grass, define entity mouse, and they're all just in a nice straightforward list. And that's like your list of all the entities in the game. And then at any point in the code where you need to do something related to all the entities, you first define that macro to mean something context specific, like create them or update them or draw them. And then you inline include that header file that has all of them. And then afterwards, you undefine it. So um, then afterwards, the process of creating a new entity for the game is just I create a new file uh, with like the entity code in it, and I made myself like a little Visual Studio template where I can like right click, add new item, and uh, like it just creates like the boilerplate code for me. And then I just go edit one other place in code that list of all the entity types and just like include it in there. And then it just works. And so once I got once I like found success with that, I did it for my shaders as well. So I can just like declare the shaders that way, and then things just a bunch of code runs to like load them and hot reload them and hook them up to various things. All the sprites are declared that way. So I used it for a lot of, like I said, localization kind of uses this um, to sort of declare the big sets of strings that are used. And it's a way to almost get like code generation without actually needing to do anything difficult, and you're just kind of abusing the C preprocessor. And yeah, I've just been very happy with it. It's kind of dumb, and I know a lot of people are very hesitant of to use the macros in C, and they're not type safe, and they really let you kind of do some crazy stuff that has nothing to do with compile time, like type checking or anything. But I think if you're kind of careful, it yeah, it can just be used for a lot. And since it's just my code base, I don't really need to worry about other people getting confused by it. But I think it ultimately it's the most concise way for me to declare new things in the code base. And it still maintains all the performance benefits of like just the really raw inline approach. So there's no virtual pointers or anything like that.
Yeah. You would still need to look out for, you would still need to remember the order, right? If you have rabbit and then you have a frog, and
Hmm.
then rabbit changes position in his update, you
Hmm.
wouldn't clearly see this, right? You would need to go like, remember that frog is after the rabbit.
Yes. So yeah, the order in which they're defined in that entity header file determines the order in which they're updated, and um, and that is definitely something to be aware of. Like I think you can go a long way, and there's all for most things that probably doesn't matter for gameplay code, but then it does start to matter based on like say in Animal Well, there's like these chinchillas that you can lure around and have them walk on buttons, and they kind of are used in some puzzles, and they have collision on them, so you can jump on them, and then they can also walk onto platforms, which is another entity type. There's this block that you can like crank up and down on the screen. It's like attached to a chain and like a pulley system, and that also has collision on it. So there's one puzzle where you have to like lure the chinchilla onto the block, then like crank it up, like to raise it up like an elevator, and then have it like walk off the platform. And if you crank, and there's also a ceiling above it that has collision on it that um, you don't want like the chinchilla to like clip through if you pull the block all the way up to the ceiling. So the order in that case like would matter, and it can kind of become kind of kind of janky if the block is updating and then the chinchilla riding on top of it is like getting pushed up, and then the chinchilla is resolving itself with the world collision and it's like getting pushed back down. And so the order matters a lot based on which one it gets updated first. Otherwise, you'll have them like kind of clipping through each other, or the chinchilla will constantly be like falling one frame off the ground and then like getting pushed back and it'll jitter in like a really ugly way. Um, and I think I ended up resolving that. I kind of forget. I think I have like a step that runs after all the entities that's just on like the collision volumes for them that like kind of resolves it in a final step. But I was never really happy with that. Um, I was actually thinking kind of actually the past few days about a new system I could design that kept almost like a double buffered state for the whole all the things on screen, and then uh, this would also so you have like just the positions of all the entities last frame and the positions the new ones that they want to be this frame, and they only ever read the last frame position for any given thing. So it's almost like the difference between uh, like Jacobi or Verlet integration, I guess, where you either like let things update in line with each other, like as you go over the loop, or you update them all together based on the old information and then don't like set their new positions until they're all done. So maybe it resolves slower, but it's more stable and consistent, and the order doesn't matter anymore. So you could do the whole game that way by sort of just maintaining like two copies of everything and swapping them each frame. Um, and then, yeah, the order wouldn't matter. And maybe that's worth doing, but it probably doesn't benefit you in most places except for like collision detection stuff. So maybe keep it just for like a kind of a collision entity system part of it. Because I don't really care what the light color was last frame or something. There's like a lot of things where it's just like it would be a waste.
Yeah.
But it's something to think about.
Did you manage to keep all the uh, project, like code-wise, all the C++ parts of it uh, in your head during the development? Or did you need to like relearn what have you done for a given system like
Mm.
some couple of months or years ago?
Yeah, it was a little bit of both. I kept most of it in my head because I worked on it for so long. I think every time early on when I took like 3 months off or something, I would forget a decent amount of stuff. But even now, I can go back to the Animal Wells code like almost 8 months later and still understand most of it. And it's kind of like I worked on it so much and I spent so many hours like sort of living in the code base that it's kind of burnt into my memory. So um, yeah, it's easy to keep in my head. But there were some systems that I would like maybe write just in one day. I'm trying to think of an example. Maybe I wrote a system to like spawn little flip books for particle systems like dust poofs and um, like little fire and forget like little animations that play. And I remember writing that one day because I needed it, and but then like never looked at the code again and used it. And then maybe like a year later, I had to go make some modifications to it, and I had totally forgotten it. It really depends on like how much you look at the code or how much it needs to change, and you remember it, or even something for like getting audio to work on the PlayStation. If I had to go edit the like report the audio system, I probably forgot most of like how that works because I it was like a task that I had to do within 1 week or whatever, and I got very invested in like learning how that works and how their API works, and figuring out like how it corresponds to what I had already done before. Um, and I kind of wrote it, and then I got it to work, and then kind of moved on. So I probably things like that I forget more easily. But like the structure of how the game is and what everything, how entities work and stuff, that's like very much burnt into my brain forever, I think.
Okay, okay. Looking back, what would you say you would do differently in Animal Well code base? I'm. We can talk later about like game itself from the, let's say,
Mhm.
consumer point of view. I'm zooming in
Sure.
on the technical stuff. I don't want to like to spoil too much also like what's
Yeah.
happening inside the game. So we can talk about this later on, but like right now, looking back at the code base and technical stuff.
Yeah, there's a decent amount of stuff I would have done differently, and it was a result of me just not knowing what the solution was ahead of time. So in Animal Well, I would say the Visual Studio project itself, like the like .proj file, is like kind of a mess, because when it started out, I just like created new C++ project and solution, and just started from there from scratch. Um, and I didn't really have any experience early on of like how MS Build works, and I wasn't using like CMake or any kind of cross-platform build abstraction. So I was just adding files to it, and it worked on Windows, and everything was good. But then when I had to do the switch port, I needed to transpile all the shaders from HLSL to GLSL, so then they could be um, run on the switch. That's just like what it expected. Um, and I was using, and there's no functionality to do that. There is a library, I think, that either Microsoft or maybe even Unity wrote, that the Switch SDK includes, that will convert an HLSL file to a GLSL file. It might even go directly to the Spear V, like intermediate format. Um, but I had to then pretty much modify the build system, like for the first time, to sort of manually compile these shaders that were platform specific, and didn't really know how to do that cleanly. So I ended up just editing like my main project file for the game, to add these extra sort of like build steps, these build targets in MS Build, and create a new like a sort of item type for the shaders when on Switch. And I kind of made a mess of it because I was like having to go on just like Stack Overflow and ask how to do it, and I was very unfamiliar with like sort of the ideas and terminology used by like MS Build, because I just had never really used it directly. Um, so I ended up with a project that was in a state where I couldn't add new things. I had to make because I was now editing the project file directly. It was now in a read-only state where I couldn't really interact with it indirectly in Visual Studio anymore. Um, and anytime I wanted to modify it, I had to go like add the file to the directory, and then like reload it manually. And so, and it was just because I didn't really know what I was doing to begin with. And then it kind of became too messy to fix after the fact, or maybe I could have fixed it, but um, there was a lot. My also philosophy going forward was like, okay, after I've changed something like one or two times, I just have to live with it until I ship the game, because like I could endlessly like improve systems, and you just have to like call it at some point and use what you got. And if it's a little painful, and it'll make you even more motivated to do it better like the next time. um, so yeah, I've already started like a new project, and it's very clean in terms of like how platforms get defined, and how I add new things to it, and I have a lot of build steps that work very reliably. Yeah, with like the incremental building and all that stuff. Uh, so that's like one thing. The localization was something I wish I had done a little better, like I had mentioned before. Um, there's one thing that's kind of both an engineering and a gameplay thing. I never got key bindings to work, which a lot of people are very vocal and very disappointed about. But I had just programmed things in a very dumb way, where I'm just like checking the literal like inputs on the keyboard to do things that I never built in any kind of like intermediate layer to make that configurable. Um, or never got, there's no menus or anything to facilitate that. So it's like next project, it'll have that from like day one, and I'll build it into the engine like very early. Um, yeah, but there's just so many things you need to make for a game that it's insane that like um, I'm just happy I finished it at all. And like looking back, it's like, yes, there's always going to be things that you could do better. and I will do better. But um, yeah, it still took so long to do, despite all that.
Do you consider teaming up with someone for a new project?
Um, Honestly, I don't think so. I really kind of enjoy working on my own and not having to like sort of communicate my ideas with someone else, or sort of keep the ideas in sync. So I'll probably still mostly just work alone on the majority of the game. Maybe I will like contract somebody to do some audio or some promotional art or something. That's like at least pretty siloed from the rest of development. But I think I really enjoy each day kind of going into my office and working and just not having to talk to anybody. And it's like very relaxing to me. And I wouldn't really want somebody else involved in the core sort of development process. It's just like a personal thing or personality trait I think I have.
Okay. Yeah, like if you involve somebody now, like from 100% of you focusing on the game, knowing what you want to do, like it immediately drops to at least like 70%, something like that. Because like 30% is now communication, trying to make sure that the other person is aligned with what you had in mind. So
Mhm.
it's a big difference. Like from 1 to 2 is much different than from like 3 to 4.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like you can almost describe it mathematically of like thinking of a graph of each node on the graph as a person, and an edge between them is like communication overhead. So yeah, adding one more node now you like it there you need n more like edges, and so like yeah, I think having just one person on a team is like a sweet spot of of efficiency. It's like 100% efficiency, and I do enjoy that because I feel like I can work a lot faster than teams with a few people. I think I'm, as an individual, much faster than any individual on a team, um, and I'm happy to benefit that. It will take me longer, but it's like low risk and it's very enjoyable for me. So I'm happy to make that trade off.
How much time daily do you work now when full time working on a game?
I think just I've been very comfortably probably working maybe 10 hours a day. Like I'll probably start working at like 7 in the morning and then go until, and then I'm gonna take like a break for lunch, and then around 5 o'clock, depending on the day, I'll wind down and have dinner and then relax for the rest of the evening. And I've been feeling like very productive with that schedule, and it's like it's been very fun. But yeah, it maybe that will change as I get later into development of the next thing, and I'm doing things that aren't quite as fun and as exciting. Maybe I won't be working quite as much, and I'll be eager to take more breaks. But um, yeah, while I'm enjoying it, that's about what I do. And I sometimes I don't really take days off because on the weekends it's still just like what I want to do.
Oh, you
Because I'm
work
excited.
7 days, 7 days.
I try not to, but the past few weeks I've been doing that as well. So it really depends. I think if the project's fun, I can work a lot. Otherwise, it'll be a more reasonable amount.
Okay, and also you're in the, I think the one of the most exciting phases of the project, which is like super early stages,
Yes,
right?
yes, yeah. It's really exciting early on, and then it kind of just gradually gets less and less exciting until like launch day. Then it like spikes up, and it's amazing. But prior to that, you're like in hell as you crunch to finish the game.
Okay. Uh, can you say something about your upcoming project, like foreshadowing kind of things?
Mm.
No, I'm not gonna push you on that. It's obviously like a lot of secrecy is involved. So,
Yeah. Um, yeah, it is a secret at this point, but I guess I will. I've already kind of hinted a little bit, but I am working on another game that at this point I don't want to like promise anything, but I think it will take less than 7 years to make, just because I have a lot of tools and stuff. I'm from the start, and I'm kind of much more informed now of what what the requirements are, and I think I'm just better. I'm a better game developer in general. Um, so I am working on another game. It will be in some ways similar to Animal Well because I'm reusing a lot of the tools and stuff, like my level editor. I'm not reusing it, but I'm kind of making better versions of everything. But but beyond that, I don't even know what it'll be. So I'm kind of just following my intuition and just seeing what happens. But yeah, the plan is definitely to make a second game.
Okay. Okay. You mentioned Visual Studio a couple of times, and
Mhm.
I come from a different brand of code editors, and there's a lot of people involved in editor wars. So
Mhm.
whether Emacs or Vim is the best IDE or text editor, have you considered using a different editor, or you never really bothered to?
Um, it's more out of like apathy that I'm sticking with Visual Studio. Like, I wish I don't love it. It's probably like the worst part of my workflow is just dealing with how slow it launches, and it's just clunky and bad feeling. I mean, I have a lot of muscle memory for all the hotkeys in it, and I can write in, write text and code in it pretty quickly. Um, and I have like unfortunately kind of coupled myself with like MS Build and a lot of its tooling. So yeah, if there was like an alternative that like still did everything that I need it to do, I would consider switching. But also, I think I'm more. That was also maybe a philosophy that I adopted early on, where it's like I'm not gonna invest time in solving a problem unless I have a clear goal as to like what it'll be. So um, I think when I was first learning to program, I was very eager to like try out plugins and learn and try out different editors and languages and kind of jump back and forth between a lot of different technologies, just probably because it was fun to learn new things. But now I'm probably more interested in actually making games and like solving problems. And Visual Studio like works pretty well for me. And I don't at this most of the time when I look at something else and consider switching, I'm not exactly able to justify like the overhead of like learning the new thing and dealing with like the incompatibility issues. Like also the console SDKs, they're very much like Visual Studio oriented. They have plugins for them or like build scripts that they expect you to be like integrating into a Visual Studio project. So if I were still just doing like PC development, I would be more eager to switch. But a big part of it is the console SDKs kind of assume it to a large extent, and I'm nervous about that.
Yeah, that's a quite concrete and specific issue that might arise in the future if you
Mhm.
were to switch to something else. What about programming languages? Because there are a couple of programming languages that are trying to be a modern C replacement. Uh,
Mhm.
Zig, Odin, upcoming Jonathan Blow language, Jai.
Yeah.
There are even like the less known, like C3 or like Hair. So, do you have any? Have you tried them? Are you planning to use
I
them?
have not tried any of them yet. I'm pretty familiar with John's language, and I've watched a lot of his like sort of demos of it and just his streams where he's working on it, and it looks super cool. And I remember seeing that original demo he did like yeah like 10 years ago, and being very inspired by it. I thought it was amazing when he played like Space Invaders as a compile step, like while doing while generating the code. Um, and yeah, um, I've been interested in it this whole time it's been in development, and I remember even thinking like, oh yeah, maybe when Animal is done, I'll make my next game in JAI or Jai. I don't know how it's meant to be pronounced, uh, but yeah, it seems like it's not out yet, and so for now, I'm still just kind of sticking with C++. And again, it's like a thing that it works well enough. I've learned to program in a style that like I avoid most of its issues, and it's pretty fast. And it's again a thing I don't love. I don't like. I never look at C++ code and go like, it's beautiful code. What it's so elegant, and I ignore all the new like language features, and mostly, and I'm not keeping up with all the new revisions of the language.
Yeah.
So the programming in C++, it's kind of boring for me. I'm more
But
interested
they
in like.
that might be good, you know, that
Mhm.
it's boring because
I
like
think
you,
so. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I
you.
think.
Okay, sorry. Go on. We have
No,
a
sure.
delay.
Go ahead.
A good. What what I want to say is like if it's boring, then you can like put your mind into like the actual problems that you want to solve. You don't spend on like realizing, oh, what's really happening under the hood and stuff like that.
Exactly. I'm thinking more like I've been learning much more about like the hardware that the game is running on, like learning DirectX 12, and learning compute shaders and how all that stuff works, or learning about the different like intrinsic processor features, and like that stuff is like where I'm like investing my time and like getting a better understanding of. And um, I think realizing that like a programming language is just a means towards utilizing those things, and it's kind of this intermediate thing you go through, that I think at that point in my, this was like years ago, but I probably became less interested in them, just realizing that. And uh, yeah, but if that being said, if there is you know a, a better alternative to C++ that is mature enough, that I would consider switching in the future if it were like dramatically better. And the languages do seem like they are better, but just haven't gotten around to really investing time to use one of them.
Okay. Okay, it's I love the statement. I learned to program around the issues of C++. It's like this is a language that you need to understand what do you really want to use and what you don't want to use in order to be efficient. Like such a
Yes.
such an interesting language.
Yeah, it's so big, and there's so many. Like I did, early on, I have, you know, it's like I got just like piles of C++ books just like on my shelf. Like this is C++11, and it's like gigantic. Um, and like the equivalent C like textbook is like a fifth as thick.
Yeah.
Um, and like I'm sure if like you looked at like C++ 20 or whatever the latest version is, it would be even like thicker than this. So I invested a lot of time early on in my career, like learning all that stuff and trying to use it, and you know, using move semantics and like templates, and trying to do meta programming and all that stuff, and feeling like a little clever when I did some of it. But I remember using some templates at work when I was at NetherRealm, and just some of my coworkers just being like, "What the fuck is this?" It's been like, "Oh my god, what is this doing?" And then I'd have to come over and I'd like maybe feel clever. I'd be like, "Oh, this," I'd have to explain it to them, and then it's like, "Oh, why does it have to be this way?" Be like, "Oh no, it's like it's a clearer way to do it," but when it's not, um, you should have just done it the dumb way. um, and you're just like uh, taking on like a liability for yourself. It's like, again, if you're trying to deal with like other SDKs for like consoles and stuff, you don't know that they're going to support this version of C++. Like, you might have to use a different compiler, and you don't know if it's going to work exactly the same way. So you really have to ask yourself, like, is it worth it? Because it's going to cause like real issues in the future, and they won't be fun to deal with. Or you might just have to undo all your code because it doesn't work. So um, yeah, it's kind of like it's it's like a shallow reward ultimately to use a new language feature.
Okay. Looking back for looking back at Animal Well, that is very much unique, and you've made a lot of things that are, let's say, well, not common in a game. Do you have
Mhm.
any things that stands out for you as the author of the project that you liked about like the design, the style? I obviously don't need to spoil the game if you don't want to, but a lot of the things relate to puzzles that you've put inside the game that are very interesting and well unique. So
Mhm.
looking back, what do you think about the game? What do you like the
I'm
most?
Yeah, I'm very proud of it overall. Uh, um, there's a just like a wide variety of things in the game, and I think some of my favorite parts were the ones that were some of the really later game puzzles that kind of really challenge your assumptions of what like is even allowed in a game. Those are, you know, not the most accessible things, and some people find parts of it really frustrating. But um, there's a few like puzzles uh, that I'm proud of, like later on. And then I think the items I developed for the game, most of them are very good, and the way they can be used in multiple ways. That seems something that people like almost universally appreciate, and it's accessible, and uh, the fact that you can do things with the frisbee other than just like bounce it back and forth. Almost everyone gets surprised and excited by, and those are just things that like for the amount of work they took, like went a long way in terms of like adding value to the game and and fun. So I think the items were probably the most successful part of the design because they kind of tie the whole game together. Um, but if you ask me on another day, I might just say a totally different thing. But that's like what is coming to mind now.
Okay, okay. We've covered a lot of topics. I would like to close on one question, and obviously, uh, you don't. Okay, I'll just say it. How is it to work with Video Game Dunkey? Because from the internet, you
Mhm.
have a very specific, particular impression of the guy, and then
Mhm.
as a serious publisher, it might be a different thing. So, how how did it work out?
Yeah, it was interesting, and I was wondering the same thing early on. So I was subscribed to Video Game Dunkey like years before meeting him, and liked his videos. So I was a fan. And then he in 2022 we were doing an early showing of Animal Wall, and we got into Day of the Devs, which showed during like Summer Games Fest. And I made a little video that had the first ARG in it. Um, and then Dunkey posted a video kind of doing a roundup of everything that was shown during that event. Uh, and it was like Dunkey's anti E3 2022 video. And he went through and he pretty much just systematically made fun of the whole show. And there were so many like space games that got announced that year, and it's just the typical like Summer Games Fest, like Jeff Keighley, sellout kind of uninspired game industry AAA stuff that is easy to make fun of. Um, and then there was also like a lot of frog games being shown, which even indies can be like kind of uninspired, and it's like, oh wow, every indie game's like about a frog now. It's very specific. Uh, but then people like in my Discord, they're like, "Oh, you got mentioned in the newest Dunkey video," and I was like, as soon as I saw that, I was like nervous to click the link because I'm like, "Oh God, what did he say?" Like, so I like watched it, kind of holding my breath, and then he got to the point where he mentions Animal Wall, and then he goes like, yeah, most of the games this year like look stupid, but there was a couple that actually stood out and looked like they might be kind of fun, and Animal Well was one of them. So he actually like complimented the game and said it might be fun. So I was like very relieved and kind of surprised. Um, and yeah, I had only known him from his online persona, which he's just kind of this like goofy critic person that's kind of over the top. And then we started talking to them like later that year, and we kind of were reached out and thanked them for mentioning us in their video. And I say them, I mean Dunkey and his wife Leah. And they at that point told us they were like starting a publisher, and they hadn't announced it yet, but they were fans of the game, and they just wanted to talk. So we had a meeting with them, and I was immediately surprised by like how quiet he is. He's like actually really shy and soft spoken in real life, and I think they're like the Dunkey channel is this like outlet for him where he expresses his inner inner feelings, but in person he's really soft spoken, and really friendly, and like almost like the opposite of what you would expect. And so yeah, it's actually just like really nice working with them because they love games, and they're just like yeah very supportive and kind of understanding, and um, they're making some suggestions for changes to the game, but they were not being like pushy about it, and ultimately they respected it was like my project, and they respected my creative intent, and uh, so yeah, it's uh, from my point of view he's like just a very shy quiet man.
Okay.
um,
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Not what you would expect.
yeah.
What kind of games do you play now?
mm. um, I play like a little bit of everything right now. Me and my girlfriend were going back and playing the Near games, so we played through Near Replicant, and got all six endings. So that took a while. And then playing Near Automata again. I played it when it came out originally, but doing that. I've been playing UFO 50 a lot. It's taking a while to get through. I've played maybe 2/3 of the games, and that's been super cool and impressive to me. I'm trying to play through Metaphor Refantasio, but I'm still very early on, and it's kind of hard to. I expect that one will take me a long time to get through. Yeah, there's been a lot of long RPGs because then I also just played Final Fantasy Remake, Final Fantasy 7, and I want to play. Uh, Still haven't played Baldur's Gate. Um, but
Oh,
yeah,
you
just like
didn't? Okay.
no, have not played it yet. Astrobot was good. Silent Hill 2. Um, Balatro. What else? Lorelei and the Laser Eyes. Played a decent amount of like indie games last year. Crow Country, that was very good. Um, yeah, just been just try to keep up with a little bit of everything. But yeah,
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Billy. It was such a pleasure. We've covered
yeah,
so
likewise.
much, so many different subjects and topics. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. This was great, and yeah, happy to do it.
Where can people follow your work?
So probably I'm like have a weird relationship with most social media now where I don't really use it or don't like using it. Um, but I think I don't know, just probably on like Steam or just go to like the animalwell.net. That's where you can like learn everything about the game. That's pretty much my whole identity right now. The internet is the fact that I made Animal Well. So um, other than that, occasionally we'll like retweet things on Twitter or Blue Sky. The Discord channel for Animal Well is actually a very like sort of vibrant community that has sort of taken on a life of its own. I'm in there, kind of watching what goes on, but that's where all the fans of the game are talking about stuff and making things. They're making like a level editor and working on mods and other cool stuff. But that's pretty much it. Um,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much for joining me one more time. Lovely discussion.
Yes. Yes. Likewise.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Game Engineering Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and follow on Spotify and other podcasting platforms. See you in the next episode.